Hello, everyone, and welcome for this first special meeting of the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. And why it's special is that we are doing a live version, which we hope to kick off and run in 2025, which involves select podcast participants, many of them that are part of our kind of vegan studies initiative, coming in and giving a webinar version of the podcast, which then will be available in the traditional podcast format shortly thereafter. So for those of you who are unaware, I'm Jonathan Dickstein. I'm a professor at Arihanta Institute, and I'm also the lead organizer of the Vegan Studies Initiative, and part of which we bring in figures in vegan studies, animal studies, food studies, and adjacent fields to talk about their research, their interests, their stories, and whatever else organically kind of emerges. So today I am extremely excited to be with Dr. Yamini Narayanan for Indian cow politics and beyond, a conversation with Yamini. So I'll give a little bit of a bio because I think it's so important to kind of frame Yamini's work. And then we're just going to dive right in, as is generally the kind of format for the podcast. So Yamini Narayanan is an ARC Future Fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Her work focuses on the entanglement of animals in nationalist and development ideologies in India. She is currently researching animals in coercive labor in India's brick kilns, exploring an anti-anthropocentric politics of poverty and development. Her future fellowship project, titled Animals and Geopolitics in South Asian Borderlands, examines animal-state relations in South Asia and considers how animals shape, subvert, and are impacted by geopolitics. Her 2023 book, Mother Cow, Mother India, won the Mid-Career Researcher Book Prize 2024 from the Asian Studies Association of Australia, and it has been shortlisted in the nonfiction category for the Crossword Book Award 2024, one of India's most prestigious national literary honors. And Yamini's work has been published in a variety of journals, including the American Association of Geographers, Environment and Planning, AD&E, Urban Geography, Geoforum, Hypatia, and South Asia. So I could go on, but that's kind of not our MO in the podcast. So first off, I just want to say thank you, Yamini, for being here. It is such a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you, Jonathan, for such a generous introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. We have been talking about cow politics and animal politics more broadly for several years now, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation of sort of picking up threads that you've dropped along the way, but also possibly picking up new threads.
Yes, no, absolutely. I remember when this was kind of your project all along. You're like, my cow book. I have to get it done. I have to get it done.
It was a cow book for a long time.
Yeah, the cow book, and then you're saying, oh, but I'm also working on donkeys, and I'm also going to do this. And so I'm so happy that it's out and is being recognized. Anyway, we'll get into that shortly. So kind of first off, what I tend to like to ask guests of mine, because a lot of the people that I talk to in animal studies or vegan studies kind of dive right into their research. And I think for the public, there tends to be this assumption that individuals kind of like came out of the box, kind of dialed into animals, or like grew up around animals and like this is why they're interested, or grew up around vegetarianism. And so what I like to ask is like, how did you get to this place? Well, I like to say, how did you get radicalized for animals? How did you start to see animals in a radical way, at least in comparison to mainstream views? And I say that if people look at your academic history, there's a large portion early on where you're not working on animal issues. So how did this become the focus?
I love the word radicalized so much, Jonathan. Radicalized by animals, radicalized looking at animals. Sometimes it feels it's a radical act to even just look at animals and to sort of see, land your gaze on them. That moment of recognition itself, however fleeting sometimes, itself seems like a radicalized or a radical act. You're absolutely correct that I did not start with animal studies. My PhD and the very early years of my career was focused on feminist urban planning, which is also a very important area of study and scrutiny. And for some time, I was actually involved with that world, and I just thought that was going to be the pathway forward. I was certainly engaged, I was certainly interested, and I was passionate about it because Indian cities, which were again the focus of my work then, are also landscapes, as we know too well, of all types of gendered violence, extraordinary sometimes gendered violence, violence against women, violence against the whole spectrum of gendered minorities and others. So this was the focus of my research, and that was possibly the pathway that I would have anticipated embarking on until viscerally and unexpectedly my gaze sort of landed on the animal, so to speak. As I keep kind of joking, I didn't know one end of an animal from another previously. I didn't have anything for or against animals. I didn't think of them at all. Like I think that's the case with a lot of people, that we just simply don't think about animals. I certainly grew up in a vegetarian household, but Indian vegetarianism, as you would know already, has very little necessarily to do with any type of animal ethics per se. Like a lot of our vegetarianism is caste-based, even though we didn't even necessarily think of it in those terms. Like growing up, this is just what we ate, and it was largely vegetarian. It was actually inadvertently largely vegan, and there's something to be said about how much animal-based products and animal capitalism and dairy capitalism has just intensified in India over the last 20 years, because there was no way near the scale of dairy in our diets growing up. So, in many ways, our version of vegetarian was significantly vegan without ever having been articulated as either. But in both cases, it had very little to do with any consideration or thinking about animals. So I think one of the early ways in which the animal sort of cut into my psyche, as it were, was I used to be on Facebook those days. I was on Facebook for a long time, and just recently I haven't been. But there was one particular person who kept sharing animal videos, PETA videos, I think. They were PETA videos, and she kept sharing them. And I found it curious because subsequently my entire social media was full of populated with animal people. But at that time she was the only one. And she used to keep, posting that. And I just because it was different, I used to keep an eye for it because I found that curious. But there was this one video that she posted about, I think it was Angora farming in China or somewhere, and she was, this was a very viscerally vivid video about, fur quite literally being pulled from rabbits. And we, grew up with rabbits growing up. We had a couple of rabbits, and, they lived for about 11 years with us before they died. But in those 11 years, I had not even known that a rabbit was capable of making that type of sound. What we talk about this animalistic scream, we talk about this with reference to humans, but of course, animalistic screams are not just, the domain of our physical trauma, where the pain is beyond anything that the body is able to comprehend. And I had not known, having lived with rabbits this closely, I would have assumed a significant level of understanding or knowledge or intimacy with them, and I didn't know that a rabbit was capable of screaming like that. And this video suddenly popped up, and and I was in the middle of a cafe in the cafe in the middle of a day, and I was weeping. And I just thought, there's something here in this world, and I cannot walk away from it. And then, of course, I started to, follow animal groups myself on social media. And there was this one, and I started emailing some of them as well, saying, what was that? And what happened to that particular animal? And there was this one person, and I talk about him in my book, Pradeep Kumar Nath, who is the founding director of the Vishaka Society for the Protection and Care of Animals in Visakhapatnam. It's a port city in India's East Coast. And he was actually quite patient, detailed, responsive to my emails. And I said, I'd like to meet you. So I went and met him without actually, even at that point, intending to embark on any type of research. I was still at that point of time doing my previous human-focused urban research. And I spoke to him, and it was a long conversation, as in over many days. I told him, I know nothing, but there's something horrific going on. There's something almost unspeakable going on. given its seemingly pervasive scale, how come we don't know? And how is it, what are the, and I mean, this is something I'm articulating now, but I guess in some type of fumbling way, I would have asked him, what are the structures that are keeping all of this hidden? Like, how come we don't know? And he spoke about it. This was a long conversation that went for days. He spoke about a whole spectrum of species. He spoke about the 30, 40 years that he'd been doing this work, um, cutting across species, sites, cultures, times. And I was, I knew that I was walking away overnight from something, and I knew I had to. I knew this was just what I was going to do. So I walked away from what I knew overnight. And I didn't know animal studies literature. I didn't know such a field existed. I didn't know the big names in the field. I didn't know how I was going to orient my work. I didn't know if there was a basis for it. A lot of people at that time within within the broader sort of academic world who were not animal focused, they were like, this is a terrible decision. This is a career breaking move, someone told me. But at that time, I wasn't thinking about this compelling force to sort of start looking at animals was beyond strategic decisions. Like this was not had nothing to this was an intuitive animal decision, right? Like my inner animal responding, as it were. And I, he every story, every species that Pradeep was telling me about, and he was recounting, of course, his own story intertwined with all of them. And I said, well, what shall I do? Because I knew I had to do something. And I said, what shall I do? Like how every story seemed compelling, every species, every animal, individual, collective. And he was the one who said, focus on the cows, because this was 2014. And that's when the BJP coalition came to power in India. And suddenly cow protection became a subject of national debate. And he said, as animal activists, we don't understand it. He said, suddenly an animal is getting the kind of attention that most animal activists dream of, right? Like at a national level, it's suddenly being debated. And he said, is this good? Like, is this going to actually help the cows? Is it going to help? Is it going to, because, any animal, because, you're looking for small wins. He said, is it going to help? Is it actually going to be a useful thing? Like, can this be useful? How do we sort of engage with it? And he said, we actually don't understand what's going on ourselves. So he said, why don't you do the cows? And that's how I ended up specifically focusing on the cows in my subsequent work. And it was overnight switching off from what I did and sort of migrating into a different path.
Wow, that's a really fascinating story. I've actually never heard it as detailed as then, even though we've spoken many times. I also, if we had tons of time, I really find it interesting, like you said, that moment where you realize you're going to work on animals and understanding that within the academy, it's still kind of not really welcome. I was speaking with Vasile Stanescu, who was saying the same thing decades ago. When he got involved, people would laugh kind of at him. I also find it interesting now that there seems to be such a turn in various academic fields towards like plants. People are talking a lot about plants. They say like, and I say like, wow, that's really interesting. But have we really have we actually really sat with these animal questions? And I think that sometimes the challenge is that it touches on so many of these very sensitive issues that you've just kind of flagged kind of in your story, but I actually would like to get into as well. And I know, I mean, if we had a lot of time, I would like kind of love to talk about your brick kiln project and donkeys and your work on dogs and pigs and camels. So I urge any listeners to really like look into these amazing publications from Yamini, but that would have to be for another day. So really, I think what I would love to hear you speak about, and it might seem kind of superficial or the main points of the project, but it might not be as apparent for our audience, is what is the main takeaway from Mother Cow, Mother India that I think you would like to, or you would like those who are, say, maybe not as familiar with Indian cow politics or beef politics to kind of really understand? And, in my mind, things that come up are things like the reality of the dairy industry, which is a global kind of phenomenon, not specific to India. But there's also the issue of goshalas, right, or sanctuaries that I think are really unknown to people outside of India, kind of the realities of these places. And then also, I think it would be great if you could talk about your identification of this kind of caste and animal intersection and how pervasive and problematic that can be. So you can really talk about any of those things, but I think those things are really critical, especially given your ethnographic work, which we'll touch on later, I hope, but also the theory that kind of works in and out of it. So yeah, I would love if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, oh, that is such a good question. Because, I mean, I've never been, first of all, asked somehow about the main takeaway of the book per se. And that's fascinating. But what is, I think there's a couple here. And I think in terms of a takeaway, it's probably easier to have a couple of really probably, the important things that I want to highlight is one is the idea of protection, right? When we talk about animal protection and when we talk about protection using any type of conceptual idea, whether it's welfare or rights but specifically if we were to talk about protection, one of the main things that I learned very quickly through the book, but I also was constantly confronted with how, on the one hand, it became very clear very quickly that, of course, the cow was not a protected animal in reality in India, right? The cow, I think, a lot is probably one of the most, I mean, as elsewhere, any domesticated animals, as extraordinarily abject, exploited to an inch of their lives in India as elsewhere. So the notion of protection then became a very complicated one when this word was constantly mobilized and used so often, right? So what exactly are you protecting here? And the ways in which we frame the idea of protection can actually be deeply harmful when it is quite literally and empirically applied to the lived realities of cows. So the idea of protection in India, in Indian political discourse, comes from Article 42 of the Indian Constitution, which proposes a very contradictory idea. It's talking about the Constitution was written in the years immediately post-independence. So development was obviously a major ideal of a vision for India. One of the things that to this end, Article 48 talks about is scientifically, I'm paraphrasing badly here, but it talks about scientifically advancing agriculture, both plant-based as well as, animal-based agriculture. And the plant-based model itself with the Green Revolution had a lot of problems. So, but that's a different topic. When it comes to, so they basically talk about scientifically progressing agriculture as well as animal husbandry in their words. And then they say, prohibit the slaughter of cows, calves, bovines, and other milch animals, right? It's asking specifically when this logic is applied to the dairy industry, you're saying that you're going to scientifically grow the dairy industry, which basically means breed a huge number of high lactating cows, etc. But you are also called upon not slaughtering the unproductive animals. The logic of the dairy industry itself, of course, is that unproductive animals will be slaughtered. And any other major leading dairy sector in the world, this is part of the continuum, the production continuum that, you breed, breeding, impregnation, repeated pregnancies and lactation, and eventually the animal is moved down the production continuum to slaughtering. In India, somehow, miraculously, that apparently doesn't happen. So the animal is able to slip away, supposedly, from proceeding further down the production line to slaughter, because our constitution says that they must be, the slaughter part is prohibited. Based on, Hindu ideologies of not, I call it an ideology because it's really a political ideology. Because if you look at Hindu scriptural theological works, I mean, generally regards all life as sacred. It doesn't necessarily focus the cows in any specific ways. I mean, you could actually, a lot of other animals get a lot more attention. If you're talking about it strictly scripturally and theologically, elephants get a lot more attention. Even rats get a lot more attention. There's a rat temple in India. There isn't actually a cow temple in India, right? So this is actually more of a political ideology, which leads us to believe that it's possible to sustain a dairy industry and actually put scientific sort of scale of investments behind a scientifically driven dairying industry, which and not protect them. So the question that emerges: who is actually being protected?
Well, if you don't mind
If
me
protection,
interrupting, I would love to quote you here because you say it very tersely and right. I think you say it in your text. You say, quote, "It is impossible to be the world's largest dairy farm without being among the world's biggest bovine slaughterhouses," right? So
yes.
this is the fundamental contradiction, right? If we know that India has the largest standing herd of bovines in the world, and then we're talking about sacrality and protection, how is that possible when slaughter is a necessary aspect of the entire dairying as a whole? And I think in your work leading up to this book and in other contexts, you've kind of spelled it out really well, especially through quoting like Kathy Albanese and Edmund Tomlin, right? This kind of notion that when you're a sacred resource, it really doesn't mean you actually get any protection in your animality or in your kind of bodily integrity.
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, so what basically empirically the state is aware of it because, if you look at um, Indira Gandhi in the 1970s called for a cow protection committee for all these different stakeholders to debate. Verghese Kurian, the father of India's, white revolution, the father of India's dairy program as it unfolded on the scale that it has, he was very explicitly against a cow slaughter ban because it wouldn't work for dairying, and he made it very clear. So the stakeholders, the state in a way, has always been very clear that you cannot have a dairy industry and a non-slaughtering dairy industry. It's an economic impossibility. If you look at the cold logics of dairy economics, it's not possible. So of course, in India, the slaughter goes underground. And when what we are talking about is a mass industrialized almost scale of underground slaughter. We're not talking about, a backyard slaughter here and there. We're talking about a very carefully organized network, because that's how a mass scale of slaughter can actually be conducted underground. So it's a well thought through structure, it's a well thought through network, and it can only happen with actually state support in various forms. So who is actually being protected is, of course, interesting because the cow, the body of the cow represents the body of a Hindu Indian state. By sending the body of the cow to the slaughterhouse, it's almost like you're sending the Hindu state to the slaughterhouse. You're sending Mother India. If you're sending Mother Cow to the slaughterhouse, you're sending Mother India to the slaughterhouse, right? So this is an ideology where it's actually the aspirational Hindu state that is being protected. And what was also revelatory was as you pointed out, the use of sacrality as a protection mechanism, or the use of kinship like motherhood as a protection mechanism, right? So it sounds almost unarguable that if you are regarding a being as sacred or as mother, then that has to be inherently a good thing, right? But here I'd like to go back to the work of feminist sociologists and feminist political scholars in India in the human realm, who have argued very strongly that the sacralization of women generally, the cultural burden of regarding women as goddesses or as mothers has actually there's a lot of really excellent work that basically says the status of women in India is they strongly correlate that. The status of Hindu women in India specifically, they strongly correlate that to how women have been held up to all these sorts of strong cultural norms and ideals, and that basically is a constraint. It acts as a constraint because if you are going to be, regarded as a goddess or a mother, it's an objectification in and of itself, right? And Martha Nussbaum talks about objectification in her work because we can objectify each other. We can objectify, and there's a lot of big industries like the film industry or whatever, it's based on objectification. Objectification works as long as it is consensual, as long as there is informed consent. Animals cannot give informed consent to being objectified as sacred or being objectified as human's mother, right? And long time child rights activists in India have worked so hard against the objectification of children as sacred, because that used to also happen in India. Like child worship used to happen in India. And and it would probably, and I dare say it still does, but it's really illegal now, right? It's just not, it's just seen as a huge violation of a child's rights to sort of make them a living goddess or a living god and worship them. So there's already sort of a context for seeing the sacralization, the non-consensual sacralization of living beings, of objectification of them as sacred, as mother. And I think it also points to the idea that claiming kinship is so problematic, because that also has to be something which is, that has to be there has to be an element of mutuality, and you cannot claim kinship with animals in ways that where mutuality can be affirmed.
Yeah, I think that it is a kind of a sober reminder that when of how much, in your words and also in Nussbaum's words, objectification takes place through processes of sacralization or the identification of individuals or groups in needing of protection, right? Because what it does is like it removes their oftentimes their agency in that discourse, and then you're talking about who is doing the protecting and who are they being protected from. So you alluded to earlier as kind of the body of the cow as not just the body of a kind of Hindu ethno-state, but also one that represents kind of the woman's body that is constantly under attack. So hence there is a vulnerable population that is like gendered and animalized and religiousized, but now also the identification of a group who is entitled to enact that, perform that protection. So could maybe you speak a little bit about how, who are these designated protectors and who are they being protected against in this kind of common imaginary?
Yeah. It's interesting because I talk about this in my book as well. I grew up in a Hindu family. I grew up in a Brahmin family. Um, and cow protection is seen as some type of an upper caste ethic. And having said that, and it's not just in my family, but pervasively growing up, I don't ever recall cows or any animals, but specifically cows as a center of focus. We didn't, a lot of, as you pointed out earlier, a lot of people in animal studies do say that they come from, they always had loved animals or they grew up with animals. We didn't. We actually grew up in very urbanized, human sort of focused environments in India, communities in India. There was no point in which, though, the cow cut into our lifestyle practices, imaginations, values, ethics, beliefs in any form, even as a mode of worship. So whereas now you can actually see living cows oftentimes and taken to temples, so people can actually worship living cows, but that's new. That didn't used to happen growing up in India. And it's not to say that never happened, but it was absolutely not common. It was definitely not pervasive. So now it's become so from the outset, there has always been, once India attained independence, there's always been a tension between Hindu nationalists and secular nationalists about the future of the country, about whether India would be a secular state or whether India would be a Hindu state. And the Hindu nationalists, of course, wanted India to be a Hindu state in response to Pakistan being an Islamic state. And they have never accepted that India was ultimately enshrined as a secular state. And they have tried everything in their power constantly to sort of reinstate or reclaim, basically, in their words, it is reclaim, it is reinstating, it is not just stating, it's reinstating India's original sort of identity as a Hindu state. And, they've been at it since independence, and the BJP has come to power before, but since 2014, it's been sustained. And of course, this is also in tandem with the rise of authoritarian or conservative right-wing states elsewhere in the world. So there is some type of a global sort of leaning towards these types of thinking as they unfold in different places. And the aspirational Hindu state, as it were, has used a whole number of strategies, and cow protection emerged very quickly as one of them. right, from the very outset about. And so what does this mean in reality? One of the ways in which it unfolded very quickly was that butchers or transporters transporting trucks to slaughterhouses, or at least that's what they were accused of oftentimes, and oftentimes that wasn't true, would be attacked and lynched, sometimes killed. And these would be typically Muslim or Dalit drivers, transporters, animal handlers, etc. And so this started to emerge very quickly and in different parts of the country. So it wasn't, I mean, largely North India, wasn't the case so pervasively in the South. In fact, it was very rare, but most of these cases were in the North India, where the BJP also had a much stronger presence in the early years. Now, of course, the BJP has sort of found its way into parts of the country where they weren't ever in power before. So these were the ways in which cow protection basically unfolded, was against. So any type of a state, any type of a nation state needs an other in order to sustain its own identity. It cannot not have another, right? Because the nation state is bounded on an identity politics. If India is going to be a Hindu state, we necessarily need another. The other are, in this case, inevitably Muslims. They might also be Dalits. They are also Dalits because Dalits kind of form this sort of uneasy positioning of whether they are part of the Hindu caste system or not, right? Because they of course see themselves as out of the Hindu caste system, and the Hindu nationalists would want to see them as part of the caste system. So so there's that tension. On the one hand, they want to claim them, but on the other hand, they're also easy to be othered. So so these are the others from whom cows are being protected from. While of course the Hindu state, as does the secular state, continues to use cows commercially as a dairy resource. And there's no protection from that, no matter what type of identity politics you're affiliated with.
Yes, and like you said, the kind of demonization, for example, of Dalits who end up doing a lot of the quote unquote dirty work that they are only required to do, and in fact many times coerced to do, given the industries that they themselves are actually not promoting either ideologically or financially, politically, and yet those are the ones who you inevitably see paying the price for this inevitable mass slaughter, right? Legal or illegal, of bovines. Well, one aspect, and I think it was really early on, and I think it's probably something you answer a lot of questions about, but I feel like in your article prior to the book on what you call casteized speciesism, I think is really critical to this discourse, because I think, or at least I sense that individuals are kind of unfamiliar with the way in which this binary works. We tend to think that human groups get animalized, right? This is the kind of all the time, and like someone like Claire Kim's book does a wonderful job of showing how differential animalization takes place. But what you actually talk about in your text and prior to this book is the way in which caste differentiation discrimination then gets grafted onto animals themselves. So it works in the other direction. And so kind of one example I sometimes give to individuals when I'm trying to describe it, not in the Indian bovine context, is kind of the way in which certain dogs, at least in the United States now, like pit bulls and Rottweilers, are then associated with certain racial groups, to the point in which they are discriminated against, not because they are dogs or certain dogs, but because of their association with human groups. So can you talk a little bit about this in your case, or at least I'm sure you see it now in non-cow cases as well, but I feel like the plight of the kind of the buffalo and even Jersey cows in your book really kind of illuminate this issue. So if you could just describe that for those who might be unfamiliar.
Yeah, great. The intersections of caste and animality has been less explored by caste scholars as well as by animal studies scholars. And I think there's now certainly more of an investigation and more of a curiosity with animal studies scholars, at least. And I'm hoping that this becomes a more pervasive aspect of scrutiny of these two intersections, because subsequently, and in my work with a spectrum of other species, including camels, and then I worked a little bit on pigs, you find that caste is actually a core metaphor Animals and animality is a core metaphor for formation of caste identities across the board. So subsequently, Kritika Srinivasan and I did a special issue where we wanted to focus on non-cow animals, non-bovine animals, to actually investigate the caste and identity intersection, caste and human identity, caste and animality intersection. And we covered camels, rats, tigers, I believe. And subsequently, other authors have also looked at the intersection between chickens and caste identities. Asadaran in ANU, Australian National University, has looked at the intersections between different breeds of native chickens and the sort of broiler industry breed chickens and their intersections with caste identities. So I think there's been growing amounts of work here. Animals and caste actually inform each, the concept of the animal and the concept of caste basically really relies on each other in India to sort of to sort of articulate themselves. And I'm not saying that this is the only way of reading caste and only way of reading the animal, because the animal body and caste needs to be read through a whole spectrum of different lenses as well to do full justice. But this is a core way in which they mutually scaffold themselves. And animals are used to both dehumanize certain caste groups and also elevate certain caste groups, right? In I'm oversimplifying here, but the intersections of race and animality basically is that animals are used to dehumanize racialized groups. Caste works a little bit more complicated ways. It's not the human animal comparison is necessarily always to dehumanize or depress or oppress the human. It depends on which caste group and which species of animal, right? The intersection doesn't depend on just the human-animal intersection, but which caste group and which species of animal. And animals are used, as I said, to elevate humans. They're also used to depress humans. So the cows are used, the cows are elevated, and the cows are used to elevate, the Brahmins. Horses, for example, are also used to, they elevate the Kshatriya groups, the nobility, the noble caste groups. Pigs get a beating from everybody, as pigs are oftentimes associated with Dalits, but Dalits also will use pigs as a way to weaponize pigs. So the pigs are basically weaponized across the caste spectrum.
Everybody's other,
Absolutely. And dogs occupy a very strange position. Dolly Keekong talks about this a little bit. On the one hand, human's best friend, that's been a long sort of standing narrative that holds up in India as well. Dogs have some type of a prominent place of respect in certain parts of the Mahabharata. At the same time, dogs are also associated as pariahs and untouchables, and so there is that type of association as well. My current work on donkeys reveals these intersections very strongly about, the donkeys just uniformly stupid, and the humans associated with them carry those associations, but it's mutual. There's a mutuality there. So caste works in more complicated ways. Whether an animal is used to elevate or depress a human, though, as far as the animal's experiences themselves are concerned, this kind of instrumentalization almost uniformly, as I've seen, results in their harm. So people will often say, oh, well, the cows have it great because, the cows are so well regarded. That's not necessarily the case at all. And, people will say the same about horses. By no means is that the case. If you a close investigation into the realities of the ways horses are used in India, across different types of uses, its abjection is pervasive. So no matter how the animal is used in human politics, is generally results in a lot of harm, abjection, and violence for the animals themselves. So I think that is really neat to sort of position and focus and center animal experiences of caste, whether high caste or so-called low caste. It's really important to center the animals' experiences because they're uniformly one of abjection.
Yes, and there's the way in which, as you describe in your book, because there's this fundamental that even Gandhi, right, had to navigate this fundamental issue of saying that you need to protect bovines, but now we're only going to talk about certain bovines in this context. And
Yes.
this is a similar way with, like, I was giving the example of dogs that are protected and why we don't protect certain dogs. And there's usually this rhetoric of like violence or certain kinds of characteristics, but they are just coincidentally the same characteristics we're using for the low caste individuals, right? So the same kinds of characteristics that are levied against buffalo, which supposedly justify their selective exploitation, is just coincidentally the same kind of narrative you see from upper caste individuals levying towards, say, non-Hindus or Dalits.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the case of the bovines, this differentiation of applying a caste lens to their protection is a necessary outcome of the realities of dairying, because the Indian Constitution doesn't say protect only these breeds of cows. They just say cows. They talk about just cows, right? They don't talk about, they haven't specified breeds. Empirically, you need to sort of specify breeds because you need to find some justifiable way of sending some cows to slaughterhouses, because there is no viable way of protecting every cow that is born. Like India's breeding industry is massive. We have a 350 million our dairy herd consists of about 300 or 350 million animals, and this is just a pretty conservative official estimate. Unofficial estimates and realities are often way higher, right? So there's absolutely no way of actually protecting animals, even if this means tying them for life in gaushalas. Let's just and that, that's very strongly debatable as any type of protection at all, because oftentimes that's what protection will mean. They're quite literally intensively tied for their lifetime, and for not just hours and days on end, for life, right? And that's just their entire lifetime. And I've seen, buffaloes and cows having extraordinary psychoses as a result of such continuous incarceration. But when you talk to gaushalas, and gaushalas are the first ones to differentiate cow breeds in terms of caste, because they are the ones who are having to, in the position of having to refuse entry to animals, because they're, the realities of being full, the realities of not having enough resources, the realities of just not being able to afford feed, veterinary care, all of that. And any number of gaushalas have been called out in India and have undergone media exposes for having emaciated skeletal animals that they have just abandoned to die of, the slow death, rather than the quick death of a slaughterhouse, slow death of starvation, where they've just emaciated skeletal and they've just been starved for months on end, right? Because they haven't fed them, it hasn't been possible to. So gaushalas are the first ones to articulate caste differences. So they will say things like, so what their logic is that cows are sacred, cows are goddesses, but it's the Indian breed cows. Okay, so they will only accept Sahivals or Kankareges or Girs. These are the typical Indian breeds, depending on different states, they all have their different breeds, in native indigenous breeds. So we will only take the native indigenous breeds, and then all of the other cows, the Holsteins, the Jerseys, these are most widely used by the Indian dairy industry as elsewhere, because these are the high lactating cows. And they will say, these are American cows, so they don't fall under the conceptual idea of the sacred cow, because that's only Indian cows. And so they'll say, and sometimes they will go so far as to say they are not even cows. Yeah. They'll call them things like, oh my God, look at the volume of milk she produces. She's a monster. They'll say Rakshas, this is a monster, while that is exactly why this cow has been bred, right? To produce those huge volumes of milk. And if if cows can be differentiated on the basis of caste, then of course the buffalo is free game, right? Is just fair game for everyone. So the buffalo, of course, dark-skinned, they call on, and these are all perceptions. They call out the dogs, the buffalo's sluggish nature, slow moving. Slow moving automatically means dumb. So of course they're all associated with
lack of care for their young compared to Indian breeds, right? Things like this, the less motherly qualities projected upon them.
Exactly. So so there are absolutely strong ways of desubjectifying the animals. And I talk about how it's not just dehumanization. That is, there's two things to this. it's not just dehumanization that is an act of violence. There's also like, debovinization, depersonalize. You can actually strip an animal of their sort of inherent ethological qualities, as it were, and you can debovinize an act of harm that is as harmful and as violent as dehumanization. But there is also the older sort of colonial anthropocentric ideology of seeing animality as inherently bad, right? And I don't think the task here is for us to not just protest against dehumanization or even de-animalization, but actually it is, Kritika Srinivasan talks about this in her work, but other scholars have been talking about, Billy Ray Belcourt has been talking about how we need to approach the idea of the animal and animality in affirmative ways and not as, so the task for us is to reclaim our human animality as well and see that as a positive, see that as a celebration. And while we cannot be not anthropocentric, really, because we are humans and ultimately we are going to be, we can actually choose to be a type of human. So I think that's the complexity and that's the tension, rather than, rejecting the idea of the animal or rejecting dehumanization as a concept, because dehumanization the idea of dehumanization is intertwined with animalization of not just the human, but also animalization of the animal.
Yes, and I think this is right. I think what you're describing, as I just like kind of zoom out for a moment, is kind of once you become radicalized for animals, not just in their animality, but you also see how much it is kind of the hinge point in so many other discussions. It's hard not to see it anymore as being so relevant. So I say that I often repeat this, but with undergrads, I'll sometimes start a class and I'll say, how many of you are animals? And they'll all like enthusiastically raise their hand, right? They're actually a little like
Great.
kind of affirmative
Big
about it. Like,
question.
I understand it. And then I'll say, okay, well, how many are you okay with me treating you like an animal that you are? And no one raises their hand.
Yes,
And I
that's
ask them why.
amazing. That's a great set of
Why
questions.
not? I say you just said that you were, and so this is what Silko writes about. Kind of, you have to understand there's a biological valence and a social valence when we're using the term animal, and that social valence is what is like underwriting all the things we've already talked about. How this kind of the kind of social valence or meaning of the animal has nothing to do with biology whatsoever. We're now talking about exploitability, viability, killability, and so on. And in this short discussion we've been having, and you've been kind of talking just kind of on the surface about cows, we've touched on religion, caste, class, gender, indigeneity, the whole topic of indigeneity, which is complicated itself. And so what I think is wonderful in your work, and what I think you hope, and I also hope scholars in animal studies and outside animal studies would see, is that like you can't get around the animal question. You can't evict it. And and then we haven't even talked about labor, for example, and so many other aspects. But I just want to kind of applaud your work, because I think you do this absolutely masterful job of, on the one hand, calling attention to these, I don't even want to call them adjacent, I want to say completely imbricated issues, while at the same time not letting, like you said, the animality or the bovinity or the porcinity of these animals get lost in that.
Absolutely. And I think the cow protection issue in India is iconic in many ways because it has been a national project. It's been central to nation making. It's been central to the post-colonial identity. It's a colonial project, right? Cow protection is a colonial movement that's become a post-colonial project as well. So it's been a core part of nation making itself. It was part of India's independence movements, like the Hindu nationalist elements of India's independence movements. It's been part of India's decolonization, and it's also now been a big part of India's post-colonial enterprise, which also, of course, continues to be scaffolded on a different, it's just coloniality in a different form. So it's a very iconic case study in that respect. And because it is such a strong part of identity politics in India, it seems extremely strange that for so long, animality as an aspect of identity politics has been missing. not just in India, more broadly as well.
Yeah.
How it's almost one of the final frontiers of identity politics,
Mm.
right? Because if identity politics relies on difference, the foundational difference is the human-animal difference, right? And on this rests so much of our racial politics and caste politics and gender politics, as we know. Like Jack Halberstam's work talks about queerness and animality in the most beautiful, complicated ways. So how has animality missed being a part of identity politics for so long? And why has being animal, humans being animal, been an experience of shame and denial, ignorance, rejection for so long? And I think this is perhaps the foundational way in which to really enter the animal question, is to look at why the foundation of animal othering is the denial of the animal in ourselves and of who we are. It is so foundational. So I think a core place to start, these type of discussions more broadly in political discourse is to sort of bring the focus back on humans as animals and reclaim it from the colonial, old sort of casteized ways of rejecting animality and the animal as a pejorative, as disposable, as ungrievable, etc.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think there's two aspects, and then I want to actually get to a question that has been voiced. But one is kind of this recognition that these colonial ways of thinking are not that old. Like, they're not that old in kind of comparison to so many other ways of thinking. So that's number one, is that these are not kind of these completely eternal or even long enduring kind of ideas.
Yeah.
They're relatively new. And second is that actually even our ways, I was talking with Renan Leroux, because talking a bit about the history of animals in antiquity in the West, and saying how, the ways we think about animals actually end up being like the kind of products of 3 or 4 thinkers that just kind of happened to have their way and kind of dovetailed with certain politics at the time. And we could completely imagine differently. So, I think what you're saying is it's kind of past the time where we actually, at least among those who are thinking about these issues, to really start thinking differently. But let me get to this question and then we can continue. We'll see where it goes. So one attendee is asking, so they're saying that they've finished reading your book and love it, of course, but also are referencing Dian Jia's Myth of the Holy Cow, which when that came out, it was quite controversial and maybe even dangerous, right, for the author to publish. And right now, the questioner asks, given the rise of right-wing Hindutva movement since 2014 especially, and at the same time the impressive awards your book has won, what do you feel has changed to make your book safer to publish? Or is your cow book not safer to publish?
Yeah, I have had so many sleepless nights thinking just about this question, and thank you so much for this question. I certainly had a lot of worry and anxiety about this book,
I
especially after
remember before when you were just talking about it, I remember your anxieties. I
I
remember.
used to send panic texts to Jonathan, middle of the night, because yeah, I've sent a lot of panic texts to you and to some others about, oh my God, what's going to happen. So this was definitely a worry. Dan Ja's book was actually is a historical archaeological intervention where he relies on hard archaeological evidence to say that Vedic Brahmins did eat beef, right? I mean, this is not his this is not an argument. This wasn't a political view. He's actually relying on hard empirical evidence, which was actually irrefutable. And when his book itself went into, he lived the last a decade or so of his life under a lot of security, and the book was explosive at that time when the Hindu right was not even in power. So this was definitely a concern, and the book came out in 23, which was exactly the year of the Indian elections as well. So I was also worried about how the book might be potentially used by other political parties as well to be weaponized against the BJP or other Hindu um, sympathetic political party. So I was actually a little bit concerned about how it might be just used across the board. So for what it was worth, I did have a legal review of this book. So that basically meant that the book went through two lots of legal scrutiny. Two lawyers read it for about, I think, 4 laws that are frequently used against authors, intellectuals, creatives in India. As a, there's this on the one hand that, the old question of freedom of expression, on the other hand, not hurting the sentiments of religious communities, or not, slander was obviously an obvious one. So the book had a legal review for what it was worth. So I thought that was one way of safeguarding it. Interestingly, yes, the book did not have the kind of explosive or even adverse political attention that I and had, and my publishers, especially the Indian press, had anticipated, because the book now has an Indian press who, took it to the Indian markets. And then we have both tried to sort of understand that on the and figure out why. And this is very anecdotal, and we don't, there's no way that I would rest this as a strong reason or final reason. But anecdotally, we've been very familiar with the fact that that especially as Hindutva goes into parts of India where it traditionally did not have a stronghold, like for example the Northeast, like for example even South India, and these are all strong beef eating cultures, right? In order for them to actually secure themselves in these places, which are new and unfamiliar terrain, apparently an unarticulated informal strategy is actually to go easy on the beef issue, and to not make that a huge issue, right? Initially it worked, and now they're actually thinking it doesn't work. So let's just stay away from the food and animal intersections altogether, because a lot of, like for example, Nagaland tried to criminalize dog meat consumption, and did it for a while, led to a lot of protests, and then of course they stepped back from it, and so they just thought, let's just step away from the food question for a while, because it's not going to work. And instead what they're doing, ironically, is actually focus on dairy production. So again, dairy, Dolly Kekon talks about this in her work on the Northeast, that the Northeast, which was never a major dairy consuming region, suddenly now dairy is being promoted, not commercially as you would expect, but politically, right?
Wow.
So they are trying to sort of step back on the beef question. And I think it doesn't necessarily work in their favor to call attention to this book when it hasn't otherwise come up. So, they would just be giving the book the kind of attention that they don't want. They don't want pervasively to be, recognized. But also, that being said, sometimes I also wonder if it's just a matter of time, because this is a live wire issue in India. And should things get to some type of an explosive issue in terms of human rights violations and things like that, because these things ebb and flow. So should something, because as a one of the publishers I met, which was, not mine, but another publisher that I met in India, said, oh, something bad, if from a purely commercial point of view, from a purely sales point of view, something bad needs to happen, and then this book will probably, just take off in the ways that we had been originally expecting. So that didn't happen. So I think it's also a strategy to sort of tamp down on beef, and that actually automatically connecting with cow slaughter as well, because these two issues have been intertwined, even though, as I point out in my book, really it's dairy and slaughter that needs to be intertwined, not beef and slaughter. So absolutely, tamping down on beef has been a soft strategy, whereas responding with offense to was previously a stronger strategy, and now tamping down seems more appropriate if they want to secure their positions and their power in parts of India that they have just newly entered. or
And
somewhat.
I think that's like critical. I mean, also we can reflect on the fact that Ja's book came out in 2002. So it's completely also different information kind of like time period, right? And what's being disseminated. But yeah, I think there might be a matter of time. Your book is still relatively new, kind of like out there and individuals learning about it. But in the last part of what you were saying kind of connects to one more question. I'm going to keep you just a few minutes longer if that's okay, because I really think that this is really relevant. And it was another topic that I wanted to talk about if we could get to it. But another attendee has asked, or has actually kind of has asked, so in the context of protection of protection, how would you respond to the incident of youth Congress workers in Kerala in 2017 who slaughtered a calf in public and distributed its cooked meat at beef festivals in left-ruled Kerala to protest against the center's ban on the sale of cattle for slaughter in cattle markets? So this is really basically the question I was going to ask, really like talk a bit about beef bans and these beef festivals, or these notions of kind of beef consumption as acts of anti-casteist protest.
Yes, yes. That's a really important question, because Stephanie Rutherford, in her book on wolves and the Canadian identity, she talks about the animal being a flexible metaphor, right? And I thought that was a great way of putting it. Because when you weaponize the cow's body as a mode of attack, it also necessarily needs to be used as a mode of resistance.
Yes.
Gandhi talks about this, and when I spoke to Muslim and Dalit people, I said, oh, you know, is beef really that significant in your diets? And they were like, no, it's been made significant. And Gandhi talks about this as well. Beef is not significant. Beef has been made significant. So if we are going to weaponize beef consumption or you know, cows, bulls, calves, whatever, if we are going to weaponize them, they necessarily have to use the same weapon back. What is used as a mode of attack is also necessarily the one that must be used as a mode of resistance, right? It's been made relevant. And this is what you see unfolding in you know, the use of, you know, in the beef festivals. You also see this in acts of solidarity. So a lot of upper caste Hindus, Brahmins will say, oh, you know, obviously we never used to eat beef before, but now we are going to eat beef because to show solidarity to the Dalits. And, you know, they mean well, they intend well. But this is playing into a narrative again. It's actually reinforcing the narrative that beef or beef consumption is the problem. It again doesn't actually spotlight dairy at all. Like, it again gives dairy an easy miss, right? So
which would be the site of solidarity.
As
which,
what is intended
as you
as an
write
act of
about that might be
solidarity,
yeah.
yeah, what is intended as an act of solidarity actually misses the point when you know, use the same product in the same way, because by saying that I will eat beef to show solidarity with you, you are actually approaching or framing beef as a concept in exactly the same way that the Hindu nationalists do. So it's not very different. It's not different. But whereas bringing dairy into focus here would be the radical thing to do, right? And there is no actually conceptual historical and there is no association between Muslims and beef, or Muslims and or Dalits and beef. Like, you know, when I spoke to people, Muslims or Dalits, and they would say that, you know, beef in and of itself is actually no different for us from chicken or fish or goat or whatever, right? You know, if you're looking at it strictly from those, it doesn't hold a particular significance. What is interesting, though, that dairy does have a significance and an intersection with Hindu identity. And that's the one that is consistently obscured, and rather a constructed intersection, beef and Muslims, beef and Dalits, that's the one that gets focused. That's constructed. Whereas the Hindu dairy identity is actually real. That's there in the scriptures. There is no Hindu ritual that can be performed without ghee or butter or milk or, you know, whatever, right? There is those strong associations of Krishna, dairy in Hinduism. So Hinduism is actually the one that does the Hindu identity and dairy actually have an intersection. And I think the response to things like the calf slaughter in Kerala or beef festivals is to actually just spotlight dairy constantly, because that is the real issue. And you know, because the calf was slaughtered to be consumed as beef. So again, we are spotlighting beef. Again, the product that is being politicized is beef. and the product that is conveniently depoliticized and is the real production item that must be that must be brought into focus is dairy. Dairy is constantly getting a free slip, right? Like a free pass. So I think the response should consistently be to actually highlight dairy relentlessly and dairy products relentlessly.
Absolutely, like you say, the dairy industry is a slaughter industry, and that's
Yes.
just slaughter, right? I think what really gets elided, and you mentioned it earlier in the context of Gaushalas, but I would like to somewhat kind of close on this score is that um, I also find that just the focus on slaughter itself can be a problem because how much it reduces animals to things like lifespan and survival, as opposed to say joy, enthusiasm, love, friendship, flourishing, all these other qualities that we have completely stripped them of. And
100%.
hence, when we talk about these other issues, like you mentioned, incarceration, deprivation, neglect, lack of stimulation, natal alienation, um, kind of just biological or physical proximity, all of these aspects, right? When we just kind of talk about slaughter, just slaughter all the
Yes.
time, it has such this de-animalizing, and I say that in a positive way. The animal is a positive way, in an affirmative way, like you said, like this de-animalizing of animals to kind of like units
Absolutely.
of lifespan, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is so much abstraction in reducing their experiences, especially of harm and violence, to just slaughter, because that lets us get away with a lot of other harms that we feel free to inflict. And I was, the very act of pregnancy and delivery, which is a repeated part of all animal farming, but certainly one that sustains dairying centrally. Um, we have, a dairy scientist told me that one of the key causes of death in a dairy farm is actually not diseases, it's actually just pregnancies, just the act of delivery. We have actually forgotten because in most cases, in the human case, we have found ways to more or less safeguard pregnancy from the outset, right? Because we are able to, there's a lot of medical technology that goes into sustaining a pregnancy as safely as possible. And while this access is by no means uniform, we are by and large, in many ways, in the Western world, but also amongst, privileged, as well as, the governments also offer, free services. And while it's by no means perfect, we have come to expect a certain level of safety with human pregnancies, but that's only because it is safeguarded and vigilantly sort of scrutinized and at every step. But we have forgotten just the act of pregnancy itself, and delivery can be such a huge drain. So people talk about things like, oh, we can leave the cow and calf together, and that's a safe mode of dairying. Well, what about getting the cow pregnant in the first place? And of course, disrupting the multiple types of joyous relationalities that they have with each other, they might have with other animals, they might have with humans. Um, there is a reduction, and yes, there is an abstraction of animals, and sometimes given the scale, the abstraction creeps in. But I think this is where landing our gaze on individuals as a research methodology, and Katie Gillespie talks about intimacy as a core feminist practice, but as a core ethical practice per se. Like, how do we sort of think about intimacy um, in ethical ways, in ways that are comfortable to the animals as well, but also to recognize their individuality and not sort of engage in abstractions. And I think we sort of, it is also a research methodological question, but also, of course, a very political question about finding ways to not abstract given the realities of scale of any type of animal production, but certainly dairying in India.
I think just as kind of a final remark on the score, I really implore anyone who's listening to read Yamini's work, because I think this does this amazing job, as I flagged earlier, of just kind of balancing these broader political issues, philosophical issues with individual animals and individual humans, which I think you do this like wonderful job too of doing your best to do this kind of active and ongoing respect for the individuals involved in any kind of form of care for animals, no matter what side they're on, but also the animals involved as well. And I think it's a very intimate portrayal, while at the same time not kind of romanticizing what's going on. And yet you do this wonderful job of also being able to evoke its complications and nuances. So we could talk
Thank you,
for a
Jonathan.
very,
Your
very
support has, yeah, I just should
Go ahead.
quickly want to add that your support has meant a lot because you know this research from a very raw stage, and you have sort of consistently been there as a pillar of support, and that has really meant a lot. So thank you so much as a friend and as a colleague and as a co-conspirator in Animal Worlds.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I just wanted to, once again, everyone, Mother Cow, Mother India, please check that out, as well as wonderful kind of score of publications. And I just want to thank you all for listening in on this special live episode of the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. And stay tuned for the next one. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.